I orchestrated my boyfriend's request to sleep alone, and everyone thinks I'm the casualty of his biphobia. They're wrong about who weaponized my sexuality, and I can't stand the sympathy anymore. I told Mark I wanted to explore women on a Tuesday night when I knew his defenses were shredded from a 70-hour work week, then played the devastated queer woman when he recoiled. The entire friend group rallied around me. Chloe moved her things into our spare room for support, and Mark became the convenient villain in my coming-out story. What nobody understands is that I needed him to be the bad guy, so I wouldn't have to admit I'd already burned our relationship to ash long before that conversation. I'm going to tell you what I actually said to him, what I'd already done with Chloe, and why I can't stop replaying the recording Mark made of that night. My hands shook when I poured Mark's bourbon that evening, but not from nerves, from anticipation. 7 years of playing the supportive girlfriend, the one who tolerated his sleep apnea machine and his obsessive rock climbing schedule, had worn me down to something translucent. I'd convinced myself I was finally being honest about discovering my attraction to women, telling myself this was a genuine sexual awakening rather than a convenient exit strategy. Chloe had been sleeping on our couch for 6 weeks after her breakup, and somewhere around week 3, I'd started joining her for comfort during Mark's overnight climbing trips. The first time our legs tangled under the blanket, I told myself it was platonic. By week 5, I was timing my showers to coincide with hers. The hint everyone missed was how I chose to have this conversation the night before Mark's biggest client presentation, ensuring he'd be too depleted to fight back. I needed him reactive, not thoughtful. Mark sat on the edge of our bed, rubbing his temples, when I laid out my truth, carefully curated, strategically vague. I told him I'd been processing feelings about women that felt too important to suppress, watching his face crumple like tissue paper. What I didn't mention was that Chloe and I had already mapped these territories with our hands and mouths during those supposed movie nights. His immediate response, that he'd need space to think and would sleep in the guest room, felt like a gift I hadn't earned. I should have seen the calculation in his quietness, how he didn't ask follow-up questions, how he simply gathered his pillow and walked out. Instead, I texted Chloe that it went okay, he's processing, knowing she'd be waiting for the update in our kitchen. The first crack in my logic appeared when I realized I wasn't relieved about being honest. I was relieved the performance was over. I downloaded her 2 days later, telling myself I was just exploring options Mark had essentially granted me. When I matched with Priya, a graphic designer who looked nothing like Mark's chiseled outdoorsiness, I framed it as research into my authentic self. Chloe watched me scroll through profiles, her chin resting on my shoulder, and murmured that I deserved someone who understood all of me. The lie I swallowed whole was that Mark's emotional absence justified my physical presence elsewhere. He found the app when my phone lit up with a notification. While I was showering, his silence afterward was so complete I convinced myself he'd accepted it. My best friend Jess cornered me at brunch, asking why Mark looked like he'd been crying at the gym, and I delivered the practiced line about biphobia in supposedly progressive men. The dramatic irony thickened when Mark started therapy, not for my sexuality, but for what he already suspected about Chloe. My culpability runs deeper than exploring apps. The truth bomb I disarmed with careful phrasing. I'd kissed Chloe 3 months before telling Mark anything, the night he missed my birthday dinner for a work emergency. I'd been using her guest room crisis as cover for what was essentially a slow-motion affair, feeding her details about Mark's inadequacies that should have stayed private. When he discovered my browser history, hours of lesbian porn, yes, but also apartment listings for 2 bedrooms near Chloe's office, I pivoted to victimhood so fast I almost believed myself. The significant damage calcified when Mark's mother called, concerned about his sudden move to the couch, and I let her believe he'd become controlling about my friendships. The hidden action I'd buried, I deleted Chloe's texts about our future together before letting Mark use my laptop, creating a digital silence he'd inevitably fill with suspicion. I told myself he didn't deserve transparency when he'd shut me down so completely. Consequences stacked like dirty dishes after that. Mark stopped attending couples events, creating a vacuum Chloe filled seamlessly, her arm draped over my shoulder in Instagram stories our friends reshared with heart emojis. My attempt at repair was a half-hearted suggestion to Mark that we try therapy, knowing he'd refuse when I insisted Chloe join us as my support person. The social dimension exploded when I posted a picture of Chloe and me at Pride, captioned, finding my voice, which our mutual friend circle interpreted as Mark's failure to celebrate my identity. The situation spiraled when Chloe's ex-girlfriend reached out to Mark privately, warning him about patterns he'd already pieced together. My worst decision, installing a lock on our bedroom door for privacy, when Mark was still paying half the mortgage, felt justified by his supposed intolerance. The breadcrumb about the ultimate secret lingered in my throat. There was a second conversation that night, after Mark said he wanted to sleep alone, where I said something that made him record me. By July, I'd unraveled enough to be unrecognizable. Mark spent 3 nights at his brother's place, and I celebrated by painting our bedroom the color Chloe wanted, a muted sage that erased his presence completely. When he returned to collect climbing gear, I staged a scene, Chloe emerging from the bathroom in a towel, our laughter trailing off as he walked in, so transparently manipulative that only someone determined to hate him would have missed the performance. My sister flew in, genuinely concerned, and I weaponized her worry, feeding her stories about Mark's emotional cruelty until she offered to help me find a lawyer. The self-sabotage peaked when Mark suggested individual therapy for both of us, and I countered that queer people don't need therapy for their identity, making him the problem for pathologizing me. The near-confession moment came at 2 a.m., when Mark found me crying in the kitchen and asked if I was okay, and instead of telling him about Chloe, I said, "I just wish you could have loved all of me." I watched him absorb the lie like poison. The major confrontation erupted at his office holiday party, where his sister cornered me by the shrimp cocktail. She'd found Chloe's underwear in Mark's laundry. I'd planted it there to suggest he'd been cheating, but he'd told her the truth. When she called me a coward hiding behind pride flags, I slapped her, a sound that silenced the entire room. My support system crumbled when my sister, who'd been staying with us, packed her bags after witnessing the slap, leaving a note that read, "You're not the person I thought you were." The person hurt by my continued deception was Mark's teenage niece, who'd idolized our relationship and now watched her uncle sleep in their basement, convinced she'd done something wrong. The direct question I had to deflect came from Mark's therapist, who'd become a mandated reporter when Mark admitted he'd considered self-harm. "Did you intend to cause psychological harm when you disclosed your sexual orientation?" I said no, and it was the first honest thing I'd said in months. The setup for my biggest revelation appeared when Mark's lawyer subpoenaed my text records, and I realized I'd texted Chloe from his phone once, creating a false trail. The worst truth reframes everything you think you know about me. I didn't simply confess attraction to women. I engineered Mark's solitude to justify what I'd already stolen. The conversation didn't start with, "I want to sleep with women too," but with, "I can't imagine staying with someone who doesn't satisfy me," and women obviously would. I'd already developed a full relationship with Chloe, complete with anniversary dates and future plans, while Mark planned our 7th-year trip to Costa Rica. The specific action I'd told Chloe that Mark had given me permission to explore, when in reality he'd asked for space to process what he suspected was an affair, not an identity crisis. This truth changes the story from a bisexual woman rejected by her partner to a cheater who weaponized social justice language to evade accountability. The fallout was immediate. Mark played the recording for our couple's therapist, and I heard my own voice weaponizing vulnerability into a blade. My justifications reached their peak. I was terrified of being alone, and Chloe felt like home. What I didn't understand until that moment was that home is something you build, not something you steal when the owner isn't looking. The full confession begins with me admitting I timed the conversation for maximum damage, selecting the night before his presentation, because I knew he'd be too exhausted to interrogate my timeline. The most damning detail emerges when Mark produces the recording, and I hear myself tell him that people in healthy relationships don't need to sleep alone after their partner comes out. A sentence so manipulative it sounds like someone else's voice. The first major consequence lands when Chloe listens to the recording and realizes I'd been presenting her as my savior when really I was using her as a shield. She packs her things while I'm at work, leaving only a note that says, "I can't be your excuse." The final shoe drops when Mark reveals he's known about the affair since month 2, when he found a receipt for a couple's massage I'd given Chloe, and had been documenting everything to protect himself from exactly this narrative. He tells me he's known I was pregnant for weeks, and that I'll need to decide paternity before he decides custody terms. The fallout spans 4 distinct disasters. My relationship with Mark transitions from broken to legally adversarial. His lawyer presents a case for intentional infliction of emotional distress, using my own social media posts as evidence. My reputation within our progressive community evaporates when the recording circulates privately. I'm not the brave queer woman rejected by toxic masculinity. I'm the manipulator who made it harder for actual bisexual people to be believed. My social standing implodes when the nonprofit where I volunteer for LGBTQ youth asks me to step down, worried my story will harm their funding. The social media element becomes a public flogging when I post a vague apology about growth and commenters flood it with screenshots of my previous victimhood posts. The unexpected consequence blindsides me. My mother, who'd been my staunchest defender, admits she always thought Mark was a good man and only supported me out of fear I'd cut her off too. The moment of genuine self-awareness breaks through when I find Mark's old leather journal, the one he used to write love notes to me in, and realize he'd been trying to connect for years while I was building a case against him. I found out 3 days ago that Mark is dating someone new, someone who posted a picture of them rock climbing together, captioned, "Grateful for people who show up." That's why I'm telling this story now, because I can see him being rewritten as the supportive boyfriend I claimed he wasn't, and I need to reclaim the narrative one last time before I'm erased entirely. The confession I made that night wasn't about wanting to sleep with women. It was about wanting to be someone who didn't have to carry the weight of what I'd already broken. I've learned that honesty without context is just another form of lying, and that identity isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card for cruelty. The moral ambiguity remains. I genuinely didn't understand my sexuality, but I understood power, and I used the former to justify wielding the latter. So judge me however you need to, call me a monster, a coward, a cautionary tale. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just the only one left to tell you that sometimes the bravest coming out story is actually the most cowardly, and you'll never know which is which until you hear both sides.